But the point is, as far as photographs go, people tend to look at photographs and they tend to believe that when they're looking at a photograph, they're seeing the truth. Because they believe it's a mechanical instrument, it's a scientific art form, and when you take a photograph, you're recording reality, and it's a mirror of reality, and in a sense, it very much is. But it has so much to do with, the perception has so much to do with the context that the photograph was taken, when it was taken, you know, what happened just before you took it, what happened just after you took it, what's outside of the frame. And I think most people don't have the, you know, the knowledge or even the interest in thinking that deeply about it, so they just get sort of a visceral impact from a photograph. So a lot of photographs are used in that way to sort of construct ideas, ideologies. You know, they can be used to sort of, whichever photograph you chose to use out of those two, for example, could give a very different impression on everything to do with the situation.
I mean, if they chose to put the one on the left as compared to the one on the right, then, you know, Americans see that and think, oh, you know, they get this kind of tribal kind of notion idea in their head, and that's unfortunately...
Yeah, that kind of fit into the stereotypes.
Well, the whole picture does, because she's topless and, you know, very poor, obviously, and suffering from leprosy, and so that's the kind of photograph that a lot of academics and intellectuals who are sort of very guarded and defensive about these kind of images, and I've read a lot of their stuff and talked to some people that I welcome their criticisms, and I like to engage in this kind of discussion about these kind of photographs. You know, I completely understand, and I completely understand why they would say, well, this is a photograph that, if it gets into the mainstream media, it just perpetrates this idea of Africa as sort of a one general vast expanse of hopelessness and an endless cycle of suffering and poverty. And that's something that, as a photojournalist or a documentarist, to me it's very important to be very sensitive to that and try to avoid, you know, feeding into that stereotype.
Now, the public tends to put a lot of trust in the media to report the truth, but with technology comes manipulations. Can you explain the myth of photographic truth?
Well, I kind of just did a few minutes ago, that people look at photographs and they tend to assume that because it's made with a mechanical instrument, it's sort of a scientific art form again, that photographs don't lie. You know, it was taken with a camera, whatever happened in front of the camera was really happening, but you know, people react to the camera, their body language changes, their demeanor can change, and again, it's the moment that the photograph is taken. You could misrepresent somebody quite easily just by the way you take the photograph. So the myth of photographic truth is simply this idea that the general public expects when they look at a photograph, especially news photography and journalism, that when they look at a photograph, they're seeing the truth. Of course, nowadays with digital photography and it's easy to manipulate photographs digitally, of course. In every other form of photography, every other genre, fashion, commercial, public relations, and so on, there's an expectation that photographs might be manipulated. But people expect when they look at a news photograph that it's truthful and honest, so that the news maintains its credibility. But having said all that, a lot of photographs that people look at and think they're seeing the truth may not be the truth.
Sort of another type of manipulation could be the way how a photographer kind of arranges, so to speak, or directs and gives order to the people in the photograph. I guess directorial technique. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a lot more common in documentary than it is in news photography. I think in news photography there's sort of an imperative that the photographer doesn't really do too much of that they just try to capture things candidly. But it happens. It's happened a lot. Some of the most famous photographs throughout history were, if not like really you know, meticulously arranged and staged, there's some hand of the photographer involved as far as like telling somebody stand over here, or even if you just do that, you're changing, you're imposing your own vision on the reality. So I think that there's a wide range of thought on that subject. There are purists who say you should never do that ever under any circumstances. It's wrong. There are some great photojournalists throughout history who did it quite liberally, and when they were attacked for it or criticized, they would defend themselves by saying, well, the main goal here is to tell a story and to get people to look and to care about the situation. And if I have to do a little tweaking here and there, then so be it.
We actually have a photo that you said that you did sort of kind of directorial technique it a little bit of the Uganda woman standing in front of the tank.
Yes, I brought that tank in there. No.
Could you tell us about it?
Well, in Uganda at this time, this was just after Museveni, the current president, he's been there for a long time now, came into power, and there had been a pretty cataclysmic civil war in this area known as the Luwero Triangle, and then miles north of this capital city, Kampala. And we were driving back down towards the city from some trip that we had made up country, and I just saw this old abandoned tank. I believe it was a Russian tank, and to me it was just curious to see it sitting on the side of a road right next to a marketplace. So I asked the driver, can we stop? And I sort of somehow convinced this woman to pose in front of the tank, to create what Dorothea Lange had this great quote. She said that sometimes a photograph is not the truth in itself, but it becomes symbolic of the whole event. So I was trying to, in this case, maybe try to create some sort of a symbolic image that sort of showed to me, we have this woman with her back to the tank. She's got a kind of a defiant pose, which she did herself. A lot of it's just herself, but my idea was just to have somebody with the tank, not just the tank by itself. So I just asked her, would you mind? And she did. And it turns out that she was pregnant. And when you look at a photograph later, when someone looks at it on paper, you can start decoding it and start seeing all these different meanings, you know, the things that I might not even think about when you're taking the photograph, you know.
Because if I would just look at it, I would probably think it was in the war, and you know, she just.
Yeah. So it's become symbolic of the war and of. To me, it was like the tank was abandoned, so it was from the past, representing the past. The woman was pregnant, so she's representing the future, and her back was to the tank, which represents sort of turning it back on the past. And all these things, as you're taking it, it's just sort of intuitive. You don't really think about all that. You just want to get come here, lady, you know, get in front of the tank.
Yeah.
And later on, when you look at it, sometimes it works out to be a little more poignant than others.
Okay. Now, during your stay in Eritrea, that was around the time they had just won their independence from Ethiopia, you were asked to organize sort of this 3-week photography training course with 30 men and women who were fighters, former fighters, and you said you learned far more from them than they learned from you. Can you share your experience with us?
Well, yeah, I had been working with the All Africa Conference of Churches in Nairobi, capital of Kenya, and doing some photography training there for college students from around Africa. And one of the administrators was an Eritrean woman named Meret, and she asked me, well, you know, she had connections back in Asmara, in capital of Eritrea, and they were just about to get their final independence around 93, 2 or 3, I forget, I think it was 92. And she said, would you like to go up there and it'd be great if you could go up there and run a little photography training course, show these guys a few, you know, tricks and I don't know, just some basic skills course. And I said, yeah, I'd love to go up there and see it and work with the people. When I got there, I was just completely overwhelmed by, you know, the character of these former fighters who were working as photographers. They'd all been injured in one way or another, so they had to leave the field where they were fighting, and they joined the government, and I guess a lot of people were doing that in different capacities. These people all happened to be taking photographs even during the war, so they became government photographers, and they had incredible archive of photographs that they had been taking throughout the entire war, and they were doing it without, in many cases, without running water, developing film, using big drums and just transferring the water by hand, and it was amazing. And they were just incredible people. I learned a lot about being a photographer, for one thing, just working, you know, not worrying about having the best equipment or any of that kind of stuff, but more so just about human character, because they had been through so much. They had married in the field while they were fighting and had children that they raised up in the mountains where they were fighting and things like that. So I learned a lot about life from them, is what I'm saying. They might have learned a few things about photography from me, but you know, they were already doing a pretty good job before I got there.